why do you change? Oh. Okay, so a couple things. This is stuff I've already shown you.
Towards the end, you were
okay, then real quick. So tomorrow at EBQ, everyone have the documents? So it should be pretty straightforward. You should have a lot of information. I'll fill in a few of the blanks today. And don't forget, you have to have your opening paragraph and 3 body paragraphs. The 3 body paragraphs will have, or make sure that they are in your thesis statement. And you have to have 6 documents. So an average of 2 per body paragraph. No documents in your opening or closing. Use them all for your body. No documents in your topic sentence. Have a good topic sentence. Then get to your documents. Don't forget to cite your documents, doc 1 or something at the end. You need that. Okay, they're not all doc 1, so you have to look at them. And no quotes. Okay, one time you use 5-word quote. That's it. They want, I want, and then we do the AP exam. They want your thoughts on that, showing how it relates to the thesis statement. Any yahoo can copy. Don't be a yahoo. And also, for 3 of them, you have to show, okay, they refer to it as half. You have to basically explain why they wrote that article or that cartoon or whatever it might be, following this generic idea. You know, blank believes blank because of. In my example, Wilson went right by the 3 to 5 because it's liberal belief in democracy, something like that. So they did this because of some historical event, or their purpose, or who they were talking to, or their point of view. And they're all basically the same, but you have to relate it to something in particular. Yes?
I'm a little confused because right there it says as these 2 body paragraphs, but.
Oh, I got to change that.
Okay,
this is so the last
it is
one.
Still the
This is for the
of
last
3
one.
paragraphs.
Sorry, I brought the wrong. Document.
No.
This is the document I showed you before. Remember when we did the
last one.
Yeah.
So just the opening paragraph, 3 bodies, no conclusion.
Yeah. Opening paragraph, 3 body paragraphs. Yeah. Because remember the last one we did in class, we only did 2 body paragraphs.
Okay.
So I just actually got wrong.
No, you're good.
But don't forget, you have to use 6 documents. Outside information relate what's in the document to stuff you already know. Be specific. Don't forget background material. So there's a bunch of stuff that happened in 1945, like conferences and certain countries surrendering, that happened that directly affected them. That's context you need in that opening paragraph. Yes? No, handwritten. And it's got to be handwritten with a pen. No red pen, no purple pen, no green pen, no plaid pen. If you have a plaid pen, that's cool, but blue or black. Handwritten.
Wait, what if it's a plaid pen that the 2 colors that it plaids are black and blue?
Black and what?
Black and blue.
Black and blue. That sounds good.
Black and blue pattern.
I don't know if I give you vertigo.
Okay.
Coming at you. Okay. No, it has to be. All right. Any questions? Okay, begin. I'm kidding. Yes. Oh, so Truman and Sarah are going to get that out, and also, and total war. Make sure and kind of separate it, so I'll do that shred separately. We got Truman and Sarah and your name on them. No. It's not one here.
Okay. Total war is
We're back in class. No. If bringing them all, you bring it to me before class. You turn yours online. Anybody out there? It works. And I know it's got to be hand. Yes, I'm on.
You can use it to your advantage though. If you don't know how to spell a word, you can just scribble it.
Oh, by the way, did you make? Instructions there, very good. Okay, there's no problem. I recognize you. No?
I need to leave.
You did.
I like the radio station you guys built, but I always give any.
Daisy, thank you for reminding me. I almost forgot. Hope you like them. I think travel is fair. I mean, it's not like the most complete history, but it gives a good background. Total War is well done. The bombing of Hamburg, read that soon. Okay, so I believe we got right to here. So I'm going to go a couple things about the war. Then we'll have to you fill in the blanks and get to the end. Did we get the ultimatum? Is this how we're going to quit?
We got to where it was 3 hours late.
Sneak attack. 3 hours late.
Yep.
And then this was a sneak attack, infuriating the United States. And yes, the U.S. had broken their code. It was the magic. That was the code name for it. But the ultimatum was so vaguely worded that the U.S. never expected it would be at Pearl Harbor. And the U.S. made a number of stupid mistakes in this. And they were caught completely ill-prepared. So we got this, right?
Yeah.
Oh, what colony did the Japanese want to get their oil? The Dutch East Indies. So they thought they had to knock out the U.S. and the Royal Navy. The assumption was they fall very quickly. This was all colonies. Here is some of the destruction of the U.S. battleship row. Even though the battleships were basically just reconditioned dreadnoughts. The U.S. hadn't really built any new battleships since the early 1920s. 4 battleships would be sunk. 2 would be brought up to fight again. They fought in one of the biggest naval battles in history, which we won't talk about, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But the Japanese would make a series of terrible mistakes. Mistake number 1 is attacking the United States in the first place. They had no reason to. The U.S. would not have gone and fought so the Dutch, a government in exile, could keep their colonies. I mean, maybe, but it would have been very divisive. A sneak attack unified the country, relatively. Not like World War I. The U.S. is unified. But the fatal mistakes, number 1, they didn't get the aircraft carriers. By pure luck, American aircraft carriers were at sea or still in San Diego. And so the 3 U.S. carriers in the Pacific were saved. If the Japanese would have sunk those, who knows what would be different? No, of course, the United States would not have lost a war, but there might have been some weird negotiated peace conditions. 2, dry docks. They didn't destroy the Japanese didn't get the dry docks, which would be necessary for repairing ships. After the Battle of Coral Sea, I'll get to that in a second. And lastly, you see those big oil tanks? There's an oil tank farm. They didn't destroy that. It would have taken 6 months to a year to rebuild that. That would have put an entire offensive, any plan the U.S. would have back a year. Once again, the Japanese plan was, they just thought the U.S. would say, okay, let's just quit. We'll come up with some peace agreement with conditions, and Japan can keep what they got or keep as much as they want. That was Japan's strategy. It wasn't to defeat the United States in an ultimate war. It was just get the U.S. to say it's not worth it. We don't care that much. We'll sign a peace agreement. That's what they wanted. So Roosevelt would declare war. I'm sorry. Sign it. Okay. And, watching carefully in the Berlin Opera House that turned into the Reichstag was Adolf Hitler. Hitler would respond with the last fatal mistake. So we got the declaration of war, the last fatal mistake. Hitler declared war on the United States. Why? No idea. Because the United States was at war with Japan and allied and unified against Japan, angry at Japan. Germany then jumped in, and Roosevelt, knowing that Germany was a bigger threat, had already talked to Churchill about committing up to 85% of U.S. resources, it's going to take a while, to fight Germany. It would turn out to be about 75%. And don't forget, Germany, they were at the gates of Moscow being defeated at that moment. This was a suicidal mistake for Nazi Germany. There's no way Germany could win now an ultimate war. That doesn't mean there couldn't be a war, a peace without conditions. So it's that the United States War of Europe. And we should have, for the first 6 months, it was a disaster. Japan conquered virtually everything they wanted. The Dutch East Indies, Burma, Thailand, they attacked the Philippines, they got hunks of New Guinea, the Marianas Islands. All this area in 6 months they would take. Well, the land there, it's harder to control the water. A massive Japanese offensive. But Britain did not sue for peace, the US did not sue for peace. The US colony in the Philippines was attacked on December 10th. The small US Army and Filipino forces, remember that's a US colony under Douglas MacArthur, he made a series of mistakes. They were totally surprised. No reinforcements was coming after Pearl Harbor. The forces would retreat to this little peninsula right here called Bataan. And Filipino and American forces would hold out until April. The last forces surrendering in May. And the reason we're mentioning this is, okay, they were left out to dry. There's no way the U.S. could reinforce it. They're on no rations, nearly starved to death. They held off the Japanese for a few months. But what the Japanese did after the U.S. and Filipino forces surrendered would personify the way the Japanese treated prisoners. Remember Bushido? They were marched to a POW camp in the interior of the Big Island, Luzon. And a third would die on that 60-mile march. Many of them would be bayoneted or shot on the side of the road if they stopped. The treatment of Allied POWs would be a war crime that a number of Japanese officers would be sentenced to be executed after the war crimes trials. A horrific crime. When Truman was trying to justify dropping the atomic bomb, he would not only mention Pearl Harbor, he would mention the treatment of POWs, specifically. Now, what the Japanese did is just inconceivable how bad they treated the POWs. I'm mentioning this because this will be mentioned by name by Truman. So, we'll just jump right to here. So they're going to try to force the U.S. to sue for peace. Don't worry about the Battle of Coral Sea. You don't have to write that down because it's not important for the class. Interesting battle, but the U.S. broke their code. There'd be a kind of a draw right here, but the U.S. would lose one of their 4 remaining carriers, and another one was nearly destroyed at the Battle of Coral Sea. But it was a draw, so the U.S. is clearly, it's like the tide is turning a little bit. I know what you're thinking though, but I want to know more about the Battle of Coral Sea. So I have an easy to follow map. Summing up pretty good. Is everyone happy with that? But we're coming to the Battle of Midway. And the Battle of Midway was the Japanese plan to force one big battle. They would attack an island called Midway, which is nothing more than a little coral atoll 1,000 miles from Hawaii. The U.S. would rush out to defend it. The Japanese would ambush the U.S. fleet and sink them. But U.S. code breakers, codenamed Magic, had broken their code. And the one carrier that was so destroyed that in peacetime it might have taken 9 to 12 months to repair, the Yorktown, that's Yorktown right there. It was so damaged, it would have taken a year, almost a year. And those dry docks, the Japanese did not repair. They just swarmed on it when Yorktown arrived. It took them 48 hours to get it back out to sea. There were still civilian workers on the Yorktown to repair it, especially the engine as it sailed out to fight. That would be enough to give the U.S. a victory. The Yorktown wouldn't survive this battle, but at the Battle of Midway, the Japanese were ambushed. They didn't know the U.S. were going to be there waiting for them. And this easy-to-follow map pretty much sums it up. Okay, naval battles are really hard to follow on maps, but I enjoy the maps immensely. Because it's just, wow! But the Japanese lost all 4 of their fleet-class carriers. They only had 2 more left, and they would only build 3 more for the rest of the war. This would be a decisive American victory. These are Japanese carriers trying to avoid American bombers. So we have Stalingrad and Moscow, and then we have Midway in the Pacific. In fact, Japan would Never been able to match them industrially. This is the turning point, and Japan's going to be overwhelmed. You don't need to write this down. I just want to give you an idea of the U.S. production for the rest of the war. Japan would make 3 large carriers. The United States would make 24. Also 8 light, 125 escort carriers. They made 2, and then they would take a battleship and just put a flat top on it. The Japanese would. So actually they made 3, but immediately wanted to sail out of the U.S. submarines. So that was all the Japanese could make. The Juno, the Taiyo, and the Shinano. Why I know those things, I don't know. It's amazing how these things stick in your head. Talk about, all of you have information, you have no idea why it's in there. That's one of those. So I can press people apart. So with that, what it's going to lead to is, okay, we saw, that's why I had you do total war, destruction, despair, and that stuff in the textbook. Here comes the Soviet steamroller. The first U.S. and British forces fought in North Africa to retake these colonies. And then eventually, they would attack up into Italy. The United States wanted to attack here, but they were not ready. So they would not open up what's called the Second Front until 1944. And Stalin was furious. Millions of Soviets were dying while the British and Americans were watching. That's what his point of view is. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But the U.S. and the British could not attack over that channel. So that's why they attacked in the Mediterranean at first, but they had to attack France. I should add, in Casablanca, right here, there'd be a conference. In 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Casablanca. So this was a former Vichy French colony. And when they met there, a couple things they did. They announced to Stalin, that Second Front is going to be a year later, so 44. Stalin at first is furious, and then he's like, maybe not. But Stalin realized, I can get the whole thing. But to show Stalin that they're going to fight to the finish, Roosevelt would make a comment that we will accept nothing but unconditional surrender. So that means the enemy's got to surrender, no terms, they must submit completely. There's not going to be any of those, okay, you give up fighting, give us some territory, and we'll make you lost. Remember, that was the Japanese goal. And it's kind of directly the U.S. goal. But now we're stuck with unconditional surrender for not just Germany, which made absolute sense, unfortunately. Because that makes fighting so much more horrible. But also Japan. Also Japan. And don't forget from your reading, and I've mentioned before, Japan, okay, there's lots of reasons why they're going to fight, but Bushido, they cannot bring dishonor to the emperor. They're going to have one condition that summer of 1945. Keep the emperor. But the United States is committed to unconditional surrender. By the way, how important was the emperor? Japan would keep the emperor after the war. So maybe there are other reasons. So, in 1945 at Yalta, Yalta is this really nice resort town here. Much of the resort of the Crimea survived, but all the area around it was absolutely devastated. The Crimea was destroyed by fighting in early 44. Just flat. So the big three met there. They met in Tehran, Iran in 43, but we're not talking about that one. Churchill, Roosevelt. And what you have to keep an eye on Roosevelt, write this down very quickly. He just got elected to his 4th term. His 4th term. But he's noticeably weak. Noticeable. Remember I told you the walking trick he had? He couldn't do that. He was just too weak. Everybody acknowledged he was slipping except for one person, Roosevelt. He just assumed I'd keep going. And then, of course, the victor. His meeting, Stalin. And so, one thing we have to know, they divided Germany and Austria and Berlin, but the big one is Germany, into 4 occupation zones. So this is a post-war. The big thing about the occupation zones is, okay, these are going to be temporary occupation zones in Germany. Might there be occupation zones in Japan? Because we're realizing something. When the Soviets take something, they don't leave. Who else doesn't leave, by the way? The U.S. We don't leave either, even though we acted like we did. It also created the United Nations. Remember, the League will come up with a better idea. But remember Article 10, that whole part about the League of Nations, about collective security, we did a DBQ, good times, right? Well, to solve that, all the big decisions of the UN will be done by a Security Council. 11 members, now it's 15. But 5 will be permanent, so we won't have this problem. And the 5 permanent members, US, Britain, UK, France, the Soviet Union, and China. The US wanted China because they're hoping China might come out of the war strong. They weren't strong yet. They have a veto. So they can veto anything they don't like. So this allowed for the UN to survive. But how much power does the UN have? Almost none. Because all it takes is one of the 5 powers to this day they can veto. Every once in a while they talk about expanding that, permanent members, Germany, Japan, Brazil, India, but still these 5. Why? Because they want to keep these 5. So, also Yalta, there's the occupation zones of Germany, and soon you'd have East and West Germany. What I grew up with, and still call them that. So, a few more things. Oh, here's a biggie. The Soviet Union was neutral against Japan. In secret, so no one knew this. The Soviets pledged to attack Japan 3 months after VE Day. 3 months after. And they would get some land and maybe more. Remember the occupation zones? Could there be a North Japan and a South Japan? Might they get some islands? Might they get a hunk of China? Stalin wants stuff. He wants a buffer zone around him so no invader can attack directly to the Soviet Union. Yeah, so wants stuff. 3 months. VE Day, May 8, 1945. So when did the Soviet Union attack? August 8th. In the biggest offensive ever in the history of the military operations. They would attack Japanese occupied Manchuria. Huh. What day did the U.S. drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima? August 6th. Why? Do you think there's a coincidence that the atomic bomb, hoping to end the war as quick as possible, would be 2 days before the Soviets attack? In the biggest and most successful military operation ever? Huh. I'm sure there's no coincidence. I'm sure it's just just stuff happens, right? Once again, this is what we call a hint. And by the way, what were the Japanese cabinet most afraid of? Atomic bombs or Russia? By far, Russia. They didn't realize the effect of the atomic bombs, and I'll tell you why in a sec. Next, Russia pledged free elections in Eastern Europe. Are they going to do it? Do we want the Soviets with that kind of power in Asia? Do you get the point here? And a couple more things, too. There'll be war crimes trials. To the victors decides the trial, right? And lastly, come on, click. On the high break, nice. The Germans pledged, they pledged to have Germany pay war reparations of $20 billion to the Soviets for all the damage they did. Now, on the surface, this makes sense. Look at what the Germans did to the Soviet Union. Why did I put a line through that? The United States and Britain are going to say after the war, no, we don't think there should be reparations. Remember what happened after the Treaty of Versailles? We don't want Germany to want revenge again. Valid reason, actually. Germany was destroyed. You can't get blood from a stone. And what do you suppose Stalin's reaction was? I could care less. 25 million Soviets died. You're telling me you're worried more about Germany than us? see elements of the Cold War coming right there. So with that, dun, 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 to conservatives in the United States, though, Yalta's going to seem like we appease the Soviets. Of course, what do you do to the Soviets? They have an army of 15 million men. Oh, the U.S. has a huge army too, so does Britain. Those Canadian and the French have 2 million men in uniform by then. But they're the Soviets. So Yalta is going to be like Munich after the war. And then we're going to talk about Yalta, Yalta, Yalta. And this will be used in McCarthyism. So with that, FDR died before Germany surrendered. Now, Southern Democrats pushed on to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt just didn't even think he would die. He just really, just didn't, it's going to be, I'll die, but not now. And the new president, a senator from Missouri, Harry Truman. Truman was an absolute unknown outside the Senate. Seems kind of corrupt, even though he wasn't personally corrupt. It was the Kansas City mob. They thought put him in office. The Kansas City mob is still a big deal. Still a big deal. And he's stuck now with unconditional surrender. By the way, he was also informed after he became president. By the way, we're working on this thing called the Manhattan Project. Truman had no idea what was going on. They kept it in his phone. He's stuck with unconditional surrender. Now he can't make terms with Japan because it would look like he is going against the wishes of the dying hero or the dead hero, FDR. And as an unknown, it's somehow he's always had this. He's got to look tough. And by April of 1945, who does he want to look tough to? Who? Say it again. Yeah, meaning Stalin. Yeah. I think it's something else in the way. Yes, he wants to look tough to Stalin and the Soviets. And so, a couple of things in really quick then. So, Hitler died, one of the most famous magazine covers in history. VE Day, right? We know this, May 8th. They surrendered the 7th, formerly VED, victory in Europe, but Japan was still fighting. And Japan's goal for the whole 3 years was to make the war so horrible, kill so many Americans, that they'll finally negotiate a peace. Japan will lose, but there'll be conditions where Japan can keep what they want, especially, remember Bushido. An honorable peace means they don't surrender unconditionally, they keep the emperor. So this explains why the Japanese fought for every hole, every tunnel, every bunker to the death on all of these islands. And it will also explain something they started in the Philippines, but used by the thousands at Okinawa, kamikazes. Kamikazes is a horrible waste in so many ways, but it's an absolute act of desperation to convince the United States to have some kind of negotiated peace. So, with that, the Japanese had stronghold islands, and the U.S. did slow campaign of island hopping, avoiding strongly held islands, and getting closer to Japan. Getting closer. Iwo Jima in 45 was an island they took as an air base for fighter planes. That was bigger than the actual city limits of Helena. There were almost over 21,000 Japanese defenders on the island. And how many had to be killed? Virtually all but a couple hundred surrendered. 7,000 mostly Marines died, taking this tiny island that you can see it was nothing more than a volcano and ash. That was still steaming when they fought. It was hell on them. A few months later, or 2 months later, Okinawa, closer to the Japanese mainland. And we saw this on Triumph and Despair. The Japanese fought tooth and nail. Now, a lot of Japanese did surrender here, more than other islands, but still, most fought to the death. Okinawa. And the thought was, Japan has got to be close to surrender. And this is where they started the kamikaze. Thousands of kamikaze, this absolute act of desperation. But tie that into, we want to kill so many and convince them it's not worth invading Japan. Surrender so Japan can save face. But the United States is stuck with unconditional surrender, even though they're kind of hinting at terms. So don't have to write this down. I just put this down to give you the numbers at Okinawa. Look at the number of losses that both the Japanese and the Americans have. How many men, how many civilians are going to die in the United States? It's inconceivable. The U.S. is predicting 31,000 soldiers will be killed. Truman will later on say 1 million U.S. soldiers would be killed to try to justify dropping the atomic bomb. But 31,000? That's unbelievable. And we're talking 1 million Japanese? The U.S. had been bombing them. You remember Total War, trying to bomb factories with this new bomber called the B-29. That my grandma worked in a bomber factory near Omaha. She made B-29s. To my point of view, then, therefore, my grandma won the war. Does anyone disagree? No. My grandpa was in Europe fighting. My other grandpa made LSDs, landing craft, in Omaha. Then they floated down the Missouri. But it was a disastrous failure. This amazing plane called the B-29 couldn't fly over Japanese defenses. They thought it could. They didn't have fuel they thought they had. There was a bunch of failures that did not work. It didn't work at all. It was a disaster. And the United States was desperate. And so they enacted this. Gotta go fast. So we're jumping right to here. And so then they adopted firebombing. General Curtis LeMay was the new commander, and he came from Europe. The United States and the British tried firebombing in February of 45 against Germany. And in a town called Dresden, 40,000 civilians were killed in one night. And soon the Allies firebombed every German city. 25,000 Berliners died 2 weeks later, one night. And that's in 45. The war is basically over. They're trying to push them to surrender. So LeMay adopted firebombing. These are small bombettes of white phosphorus and a new firebomb called napalm, jellied gasoline. And the night of March 10th, 9th and 10th of 1945, Tokyo was firebombed. They came in at night, at low level, and dropped thousands of tons of firebomb. This is Tokyo with the firebomb. And in one night, 120,000 civilians were killed. Half of Tokyo was gone. I don't mean like damaged, I mean gone. LeMay got another star, and this was seen as a great success, the mass murder of civilians. Remember the horrible logic of total war. So what did the United States do after that? They firebombed every place they could. They firebombed every Japanese city, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The only reason they didn't firebomb more is they ran out of bombs. They firebomb, restock the bombs, firebomb. And this map shows the percentage of all these towns killed. Like Kobe, which is the size of Baltimore, so about 1.5 million, 55% gone. Tokyo, 50. Yokohama, the harbor city, 57% gone. Osaka, 35% gone. And I don't mean damaged, I mean gone. And it's important to understand, before the atomic bombs were dropped, the U.S. was firebombing all these cities. So think about the point of view of the generals who made the decision. It wasn't Truman, it was the generals. And they're like, what's the difference between one atomic bomb and 300 planes dropping firebombs? We're killing Japanese civilians at a rate that's incomprehensible. What's the difference? Actually, there's a big difference. But to their point of view, what's the difference? We're killing them anyways. We've already made the moral leap that we will kill everybody to win this war. Yes?
Are the names of the American cities, are those like the size?
Yeah, comparable size. So, at the same time, U.S. submarines had cut off Japan. Japan needed to get most of their resources from areas they conquered, like China or the Dutch East Indies. They had cut off Japan by the summer of 45. By August, they had 3 months of oil and 6 months of food left, of storage. They could not fight anymore. Their military had been defeated. Their navy was basically destroyed. The cream of their army was gone. Heck, they had 1 million men in China, but they're stuck there. They're arming little kids and old men and women to fight. They're at the end. But they won't unconditionally surrender. So, while that's going on, another wartime conference. Oh, almost forgot this. There's a little thing called an atomic bomb. The U.S. began the Manhattan Project technically in 39, but in 41, because of the Germans. Before Germany, it's anywhere from 2 to 4 billion, depending on how you measure, which back then is a lot of money. I know today that's basically an accounting, but back then that was a lot. Okay, with the federal budget, it kind of is an accounting. But J. Robert Oppenheimer right here was the scientist in charge, and they did most of the work at Los Alamos in secret. They did not have the bomb done before Germany did. And they found out Germany was not building it. They didn't have the resources. But Japan was still fighting. By the summer, 3 bombs were made. 2 of the implosion type of bomb, and they had to test that one. And that would be codenamed Trinity. July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was deployed. Now, don't forget, we're firebombing like mad. Everyone got that? We're still firebombing. Now we're firebombing in the daylight. Japan can't stop it. They can't do anything. Our planes are just flying over from carriers, just hitting each other once. This was the test. The thought was it would be about 5 to 15 kilotons, 5 to 15,000 pounds of TNT. And there was also a chance it could destroy the world. They thought it might cause a chain reaction in the atmosphere and blow the whole thing up. They rolled the die and did it anyways. It turned out to be about 17 kilotons. This would be the prototype atomic bomb. Little did we know that the Soviets had spies there, and the plans for the bomb was already on the way to Moscow. We didn't know that. But while that's going on, there's another wartime conference at Potsdam. Potsdam, Germany. And Stalin was the victor. You can almost imagine Stalin strutting in. A day late. He made everyone wait. And he looked at it like, look at these clowns. Truman, who's Truman? FDR was a giant. Truman's nothing. So Truman already worried about being bullied. It's going to be bullied. Churchill went there, but his party lost the first election that Britain would have since the war began. The Labour Party won, and Clement Attlee would come back. Now, Attlee was a very able politician, but still, the Stalin. So here, they did announce, Britain and the United States announced the Potsdam Declaration. Nobody knew the Soviets were going to attack. They kept that secret. They're still neutral, even though they're going to attack in less than a month. The Potsdam Declaration told Japan to surrender unconditionally or have total destruction. Now, what do you suppose the Japanese point of view was to that? It is already happening. Another empty threat. They want a peace agreement to keep their emperor. By the way, this is going through the destruction of Berlin right here. Potsdam is right outside of Berlin. You can go to the hotel, the resort where they had it. It's really cool. And Mr. Long, Matthew, just so you know, Mr. Long, his dad was there. His dad was in the 2nd Armored Division. They sent a regiment of that because the first American forces into Berlin after the surrender. So he was in Berlin for Potsdam. One of those weird little connections in history. And a couple more things. You can argue that the Cold War really began in Potsdam. And you notice the first atomic bomb was dropped August 6th. The second one was dropped August 9th. The Soviets said, you know that whole thing about elections? No. We're not going to have it. We want friendly states at the buffer zone between us and Germany. For which, understandable, but doesn't that look like, oh no, what are they going to do in Asia if we let them in? More. The U.S. said no reparations. Also, which Stalin was furious. Truman heard about Trinity. He almost in glee ran up to Stalin and said, I have a bomb that can destroy a city. He expected Stalin to go, oh no! What did Stalin do?
Yeah, I did not.
Just puffed on his pipe and said, good, I hope you use it against each other. And Stalin already knew because of the spies. Truman was so mad. Truman did not make the order. The army had already decided they're going to drop the bombs. We have them, we're going to use them. We have 2, so we're going to use 2. So, last thing. Japan sent peacekeepers, and they wanted to keep their emperor. They got back to the United States, and like the Potsdam Declaration, how did the U.S. react to this? We mostly ignored it. We said some quibble words, like maybe they could keep their emperor. But to Japan, okay, well, we're still negotiating. We're still negotiating. The USO wants unconditional surrender. And don't forget all the rest. Japan's out of food. Japan is running out of supplies. Japan is militarily defeated. But here's the US point of view. They might be ready to quit in 3 months. But how many more Americans might die in those 3 months, even if we don't invade? But what else might happen in those 3 months? Who's going to enter the war? And who knows how the history of the the world will be? So don't forget, the U.S. is already bombing. They're attacking. Firebombing kept going. Wow! In between the droppings of the 2 atomic bombs, it's not like they quit doing it. In fact, there was a U.S. aircraft carrier task force bombing Japan too at that same time. So don't think, oh, well, you just dropped the atomic bombs and stuff like what? No, there's constant attacks. Stuff I already talked about, but let me show you one thing really quick. That's the Soviet offensive in Manchuria. And that happened on August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima. Nagasaki was the next day. Japan would surrender 6 days after this. In their cabinet meetings, all they talked about was the Soviets. Oh my God, the Soviets. They hated the Americans. They were terrified of the Soviets. Terrified. And so, on August 15th, Japan would announce a ceasefire, and they would formally cease fighting and surrender without conditions. There was a failed coup attempt. The emperor actually went on the radio. So, I know I went through a lot of things quickly. How do you think? What do you think? Does that fill in some blanks? So don't forget, they wanted to avoid the cash. They didn't want to invade, but we also knew Japan was at the end. Would they surrender? We don't know. But they were terrified of the Soviets. Could the reasons have been very complex? And don't forget one other thing when you're on your DBQ. Japan was militarily defeated, but wars aren't decided by militaries. They're decided by politicians. And anyone who says that is a politician who's trying to deduct their responsibility. Have fun with it. Look at this.
Amen.
Just make sure you have something kind of tied all over. That was really good. And the documents really do basically go.
Yeah, I was looking at it and thinking, what can I do so make it easy?
And you have to be practical when you write that, even if you want to go a little bit different than what you think.
Yeah.
All right, people, we got work to do. Have a good day.
I thought this was study hall.
Yeah,
We have to write DBQ. Clear your desk. Let's go.
That is not funny.
That joke never gets old.
No, it's very, it was also.
We have to write a DBQ.
Oh,
Let's go.
Today?
it's a meme joke.
No, not today.
It's tomorrow. It's tomorrow for everybody except for.
No, it's Wednesday.
Okay, so clear your desk. No, I'm sorry, get your notes. I really did not mean to make a joke there. That one was purely accidental.